science and technology are often spoken of in the same breath, but they're actually very different disciplines. Science is a way of knowing, a particular way of thinking and understanding the universe. Technology, on the other hand, is a practice. It's a thing that people just do. You can certainly have technology without science, or you can even have technology that is premised on pseudoscience. It doesn't really matter. The only thing about technology is, does it actually work? And engineers, the way they think, it's very different from how scientists think. And so even though we sort of conflate the two in a lot of contexts and we call science fiction, if you actually examine science fiction, a great deal of science fiction, or what's classified as science fiction, are really technology fiction. They are stories about the way humans express themselves and develop who they are and tell their own story through the medium of technology. And so I think in a lot of ways, tech-fi would be a more accurate genre term for certainly for what I do, and also for what a lot of other sci-fi writers do. We are much more concerned about technology and how it relates to humanity.
What is up, everybody? You're listening to episode 86 of SFF Addicts. I'm your host, Adrian M. Gibson, and welcome to your weekly dive into the world of science fiction, fantasy, and writing craft. Joining me, as always, is my co-host, the Chewie to my Han Solo, the Joker to my Commander Shepard, MJ Kuhn. How's it going, MJ?
Hello, I am doing lovely. How are you?
Doing very well, thank you. And if you want to support that lovely human being, you can pick up her books, Among Thieves, and its sequel, Thick as Thieves. If you want a complete duology, full of raucous adventure and pirates and swords and fighting and death and all kinds of lovely stuff like that, you're going to love Among Thieves. There's also
Death
heists.
and all kinds of lovely stuff. What a great juxtaposition that was.
And how many heists are there in those books? Like 30? I don't know.
Like half a dozen at least, yeah, between the two of them.
Great time, yeah. So yeah, go support MJ and her work. As well, you can also check out some stuff about my debut novel, Mushroom Blues. So on January 17th, we're going to be doing a cover reveal. I'm going to be at TBRCon 2024. And then all throughout February and March, I'm going to be bombarding your ears and annoying the hell out of you with a bunch of promotional material. Also, you can check us out on Patreon and the merch store. So check the links in the description to support what we do here. Also, don't forget to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast app. And subscribe to the FanFiAddict YouTube channel, where this and every other episode of the show is available in full video. And now, joining us once again is the wonderful Ken Liu, author of the Dandelion Dynasty series, the Paper Menagerie short story collection, and more, including this lovely boy right here, The Grace of Kings. How are you today, Ken?
Hi, Adrian and MJ. It's a pleasure to be back.
Yeah, thanks for being here again. And a heads up, this is part 2 of our 2-part chat with Ken, so I recommend checking out part 1 to get to know him better. Today, though, we're getting technical, talking about technology fiction and exploring the concept of technology as story. So to start off this masterclass, you mentioned to us in our initial emails your idea of the genre of sci-fi being a misnomer, that most sci-fi is actually tech-fi, stories that center around the role of technology. So can you elaborate upon this?
Yeah, I can. So science and technology are often spoken of in the same breath, but they're actually very different disciplines. Science is a way of knowing, a particular way of thinking and understanding the universe. Technology, on the other hand, is a practice. It's a thing that people just do. You can certainly have technology without science, or you can even have technology that is premised on pseudoscience. It doesn't really matter. The only thing about technology is, does it actually work? And engineers, the way they think, it's very different from how scientists think. And so even though we sort of conflate the two in a lot of contexts and we call science fiction, if you actually examine science fiction, a great deal of science fiction, or what's classified science fiction, are really technology fiction. They are stories about the way humans express themselves and develop who they are and tell their own story through the medium of technology. And so I think in a lot of ways, tech-fi would be a more accurate genre term for certainly for what I do, and also for what a lot of other sci-fi writers do. We are much more concerned about technology and how it relates to humanity, as opposed to science per se.
Yeah, I like that. And it's like tech-fi just sounds way more cool. Sci-fi kind of feels burnt out at this point. I'm tired. Whatever. Let's get some tech-fi in here. Or tech punk. Like, yeah, bring in the punk a little bit more.
I feel like I could benefit from an example to really drive it home, though. Do you have any examples of books that you feel like really exemplify tech-fi to kind of
I suppose I can. So let's see. So an example, obviously, we can think of what would be a good example. A good example would be something where the science is not particularly believable, plausible, or even central. So for us now, looking back on a lot of classical sci-fi, they're really tech-fi. I mean, the great example of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, that's an example of tech-fi. It's not so much the science that was interesting; it's the idea of the practice of crafting things out of electricity. I mean, electricity might as well be magic for all the scientific plausibility behind any of that. But the idea of animating and crafting life out of non-life, that is inherently interesting to people. Another example would be, I mean, this is a little bit of focusing on my own thing, but a lot of steampunk and a lot of other dash punk genres are really tech-fi. They're not particularly interested in the science of it. It's more about the pleasure of working with the technology, of working out how the crafting of elaboration of the technology vocabulary of chrome and leather and steam and goggles and all that stuff, how that helps a society express itself. So that's an example. And of course, my own epic fantasy, the Danzan Dynasty, even though it's styled as epic fantasy, fundamentally it's much more concerned with the evolution of technology and how technology in all its different manifestations, including the software and the hardware, meaning machines as well as social codes, change the way society, the evolution of the society, and change the fate of millions of people. It's really fundamentally a story about technology.
Yeah, well, building on that, I mean, as you say, like technology fiction doesn't even have to be analogous to sci-fi. There are ways in which technology fiction can be fit into fantasy molds, into secondary worlds, and all that kind of stuff. So, do you want to elaborate on that a little bit and kind of explain how, not just in your work, but how fantasy worlds and secondary worlds can approach technology fiction?
Yeah. So the way I think about this is, you want to go back to first principles, right? Which is, let's think about what is technology, right? So technology, if you dig into the roots, they come from, technology, the word comes from two Greek roots, techne and logia. And techne is skill. It's a particular kind of knowledge. It's skill. It's craft. It's the same root behind text, which literally means weaving, right? So weaving is our oldest craft, and techne is
textiles.
Right, exactly. It's the style. It's the knowledge and skill behind craft. Logia, it means discourse, but the root of that is gathering. So logs are things you gather, and to collect is to gather things. A speech is literally a gathering of words, right? So discourse is a gathering of words. So technology is a discourse about skill, if you will, which I find to be very evocative of what it is we're actually doing. Um, I think there's been a very long tradition in certainly in the Western tradition, but it's not limited to the Western tradition. A lot of philosophical traditions have long posited a kind of opposition between humanity and technology. The idea is that somehow the more technology we rely on, the less human we become. I mean, you can see a very early manifestation of this in Plato's dialogues, where he rails against a technology that corrupts the minds of the youth. So he talks about how this technology makes young people think that they know something when they don't. It makes young people forget things. It makes young people not realize that the only way to actually know something is to discourse, to debate, to argue, to engage in critical thinking. And instead, this new technology tells them to just rely on what's already being done, to repeat what has happened before, to basically reproduce what has already been done by some other mind. Now, you might think I'm talking about ChatGPT. That is not what Plato was talking about. Plato was talking about writing. The technology he was railing against
Right.
was writing. So there's this long tradition in Western thinking that says the more we become reliant on technology, even if it's something like writing, the less human we become and the less we have agency. Now, I think this is a very flawed point of view. I mean, I would say that, if you told people, go study beavers, but ignore the dams they build. Do not look at dams. Or go study bees, but do not pay any attention to their hives.
Just eat their
That's
honey and
silly.
fuck off. Don't worry about it.
Right. I love that. But we would obviously think that's not the right approach. You can't. I mean, obviously, the dams and the beehives and the termite mounds are manifestations of the essence of these creatures, that they externalize their genetics and their mental processes, such as they are, in some way in these physical things. Well, humans are no different. I mean, in fact, humans are even more so. I mean, how can you possibly understand human nature without understanding human craft? We are so interwoven, textile, we're woven into our technology that it is not possible to speak of humanity or human nature without reference to our craft. The two are really the same. Language is one of our oldest technologies, and we can't even think in some sense without language. So to say that, you can sort of take apart human nature from human craft, it's nonsense, really. And I would argue that that's what makes TechFi so interesting. A lot of so-called realist literature still deals with technology as, a kind of, with a sort of disdain. That is, the characters are characters, and all the superficial technology around them is just, distractions. We to understand human nature, we need to pare away all the trappings of technology and focus on characters as they are. A lot of realism is about that. It's about focused on characters per se. But I think they have it backwards. In some ways, I would argue TechFi is the most realist mode of fiction. It's more realist than so-called realism, because TechFi, by placing so much focus on technology, on human craft, delves deeper into human nature because it encompasses more, rather than just focusing on the flesh and the parts that's not externalized in the form of artifacts and institutions. TechFi tries to focus on all of that, and it gives a more comprehensive picture of what humanity actually is, because you can't understand this without this. And I would argue that, technology properly understood encompasses all the modes in which we externalize our minds. Technology, in my definition, is any craft, any skill that represents a externalization of the human mind. So in that conception, a map is a form of technology, because it's literally an ordering of the physical universe into our minds, and also a projection of our mental patterns onto the universe. A clock is also a technology, obviously, because it measures time. It sort of gives name to time, and it externalizes our mental conceptions into the universe. Same thing with custom. Same thing with religion. Um,
I
and
mean, even
so,
things as like as seemingly basic as when we look at the broad trajectory of human development and the development of the human brain as we came from apes and advanced into more human-like forms, fire, hunting, and the development of societies centered around things like agriculture, which is why I think it's so perfectly analogous to something like fantasy, where people don't always think about the technology in fantasy worlds, but technology, like you were using the references, the analogies to bees and to beavers and ants, these different things. Those technologies don't seem like technologies because they're seemingly part of the natural order of that particular species. But when it comes to human, what's natural to our species? Well, it's socialization, it's language, it's societal development over things like agriculture and
mhm,
cities and towns and all that kind of stuff. But it's like it goes all the way back to super basic things like I think a technology as simple as a spear, a wooden stick sharpened into a spear being used for hunting. I think I talked to Tade Thompson about this. That in and of itself is a tool that is an extension of the human mind, and it is a
mhm.
technology that is being used for a purpose that it was not originally intended for, which is to be a branch on a tree. So I think it's like
Mhm.
it goes into such deep levels that people don't really think like how technological fantasy can be, but also how
Right.
technological human history can be.
Right. And you might ask the question, okay, so what? How does that help us write more interesting fiction? Even if we accept that technology is part of human nature, what does that mean? Well, there's a bunch of implications of that I think are very interesting, right? One is the idea that technology not being external to human nature is part of human nature, and therefore you can see how technology is not static, but rather it's a process. Like any discourse, it's a it's a it's a dialogue, and it keeps on evolving. So in the same way that you know it's not that humans invent technology. Technology also invents humans, right? So a good example of this is, what Winston Churchill said. So after World War II, as you know, the House of Commons was destroyed during World War II, and so it had to be rebuilt. And there was a lot of debate over how the House of Commons would be rebuilt. And Churchill was one of those who advocated that the House of Commons be rebuilt exactly the way it was. If you've seen the Prime Minister, talks to MPs. Uh, segments, then you'll see that it's this long rectangular chamber with the opposition on one side and the majority on the other. And Churchill said, "That's the point, right? We build our houses, but then the houses build us." His argument was that the two-party system of British democracy was essentially produced by the shape of the House of Commons. Because the shape of Commons was rectangular and had one side versus the other, it naturally promoted conflict in the two-party system. You can't separate the two. They built the House, and then the House built British democracy.
But on
Now,
top
I
of that,
think,
not only did it produce conflict, but it produced debate. And
yes,
I think
debate,
debate is
exactly.
the key.
You could face each other and debate. So now I think this argument is perhaps I'm not entirely sure that this particular argument is all that strong, because there's a kind of determinism to it that I'm not entirely buying. But the idea that you shape your houses and that houses then shape you is very important. We do discourse in technology, and the technology then talk back to us and shape who we are. I think that's incredibly important, not just for science fiction, but if you're writing fantasy, if you're writing any kind of fiction, really, when you're talking about the the nature of institutions and artifacts, all of them shape the people, and they also express, and this is the second part, they express the values of those who built them as well, right? This is the most important thing, I think, which is technology is not some sort of neutral thing that you find. Every piece of technology, in some ways, is a piece of discourse by people, by some people to other people, or they are contested grounds of speech between different groups. So every time you're looking at an artifact or a law or an institution or any kind of technology, broadly said, it is expressing values. The very existence of that technology expresses the values of the inventors and also those who promoted it and also those who kept it and maintained it. But it also speaks for those who were opposed to it, those who hacked it, those who tried everything they could to destroy it. The very shape of a piece of technology, the very shape of a highway, for example, or the very shape of a city represents all of the individuals who did everything they could to speak and express their values in the shape of those things. Why is Los Angeles shaped the way it is? Well, it is the result of a series of decisions about cars. I mean, you go look at Los Angeles history and read about how um, the various laws about the number of parking spaces that must be reserved for each unit of housing. It just keeps on going up and up, from 0.1 to 1 to 2 to 2.5. I mean, no wonder Los Angeles developed into this thing where you have islands of buildings surrounded by oceans of parking lots. This expresses a certain kind of value.
Rivers of freeways and all kinds of
I was
just
saying,
ridiculous.
infamous for being one of the worst
Oh my
cities to
God.
drive in the country.
But Ken, I thought of cars when you were bringing up this notion of expression. How you could look at certain eras of car manufacturing, and you look at American car manufacturing versus, say, Japanese car manufacturing. You look at companies like Toyota or Hyundai or what have you, and then you go to the States, let's say like in the 70s or in the 80s, especially when Japanese car manufacturing blew up. The design and like the functionality of the cars is completely representative of the societies that they come from. The
Absolutely.
American design is bigger. It's brash. It's like the muscle car mentality that came from the United States is all about that like American sort of bravado and that patriotism. And then you look at Japanese cars, which are much more sort of function, much more based in like functionality and use value and stuff like that, as opposed to sheer aesthetics for the purpose of expressing this certain sort of mentality. It's so fascinating.
Absolutely. And then you look at cities that are not built with those values in mind. You look at these very old European cities that have no room for cars, really. They were not built for cars. They were built for humans to walk around. And you look at how dense they are and how they're shaped, how they invite other species even to move in and live among humans, with spaces for doves, with spaces for bats. It's interesting to sort of think about what are the values expressed by a style of construction like this versus a style of construction like that. In one particular shape of towns and cities, you can see that the idea is that humans are supposed to live within a web of communities, that where they work and where they live and where they worship are all put together into the same space, versus a very different kind of construction, say Los Angeles, where it is clearly envisioned that where you work and where you live are entirely different places, and that the idea that you would have all of them within the same space is anathema, that you would just live a point-to-point existence where you're enclosed within tiny bubbles. In fact, this vision is expressed even by visions of the future. There's a whole series of very prominent cartoons, I guess I would call them, called Closer Than We Think, which was published during the age of the Jetsons and NASA's heyday, which offered these were newspaper comics intended to give viewers in America a taste of the future and to sort of see where they were going. And one of the most striking images I remember from these series of comics is this idea of houses of the future. And it sort of portrays these suburban houses being placed next to each other, each of them enclosed within a glass bubble. such that they could be completely safe from the weather and you could just do whatever you wanted enclosed within this glass bubble. I think it's actually, sort of a very potent image, that this is how we imagine American suburban life, that you would be living within a little bubble, not in a community, but in a bubble,
That
which is really
individualism.
amazing to me. And
it kind of came to fruition, but just more in like a mental and a psychological sense,
more of
than it did.
of a technological echo chamber situation.
Right.
You know,
you could say you could say that Bowling for Columbine was presaged by that vision. This is what they had in mind. I find that this view of technology to be really interesting, because now if you're, whether you're writing science fiction, fantasy, historical fiction, or even just realist fiction, you can now examine and think about each piece of technology you put into your fiction and what values it's expressing, right? I think the idea of thinking of technology as bits of speech, as utterances from the inventors, from the hackers, from the salespeople, from the marketing people, from critics, from rebels, I think it changes the way you think about the world. The setting is no longer passive, but depositions of utterances from other people. We live among the values of all those who come before us, their manifestation. We literally walk among the externalization of the minds of other people. I mean, every time I hold up a phone or drink from a mug, I'm literally interacting with bits of the externalization of other people's minds. That is a very powerful idea, and it really changes the way we think about, the way we live, as well as the kind of stories we're trying to tell.
Yeah, because it's like, on one hand, we are using technology to communicate more effectively, even if it's our values and our ideas and the ways we want to express ourselves through the physicality of something. And sometimes it's not even physical, like you were saying, like the distinction between hardware and software. And on the other hand, there's ways in which we can communicate about technology more effectively. And then on top of that, since technology and humanity are so intertwined, I love this notion that you bring up of like technology as story, technology as our epic poem, and how interwoven we are in the textile, in like the textile tapestry of human history. How can we view technology as both a story in and of itself and as a tool for understanding ourselves and the stories that we tell ourselves?
100%. I mean, it's both and everything, right? I mean, think about what are the institutions we choose to keep. The limited liability corporation is an incredibly important piece of technology. Without it, it could be argued that much of the European exploration and settlement of the New World would not have been possible. The limited liability corporation was what allowed a pooling of resources beyond the clan and the family, and to create the kind of conditions possible to engage in these massive endeavors. And the fact that the corporation now persists and we keep on taking this institution and endowing it with more rights and more obligations and more sort of separate personhood is also deeply interesting. We take this institution, this fiction, and we keep on giving it all these attributes of personhood. Why do we do this? What are the values are we expressing by doing this? What does it mean to say that a corporation has free speech rights? This would have been incomprehensible, I would argue, to many of our founding fathers, but we now accept it as a thing that is true. How did we end up evolving the technology in this direction and say that this is okay? I mean, if you think about it, this is rather bizarre. I mean, this is the real world we live in. But if you invented a fantasy world in which people go around and say these imaginary things have rights and they are very important. They speak, they do things, they have morals. We would have been like, what kind of bad world building is this?
Actually, I think Ecuador was one of the first countries in the world to give its
corporations free speech.
No, to give its nature sort of like human rights.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's kind of like, it's like the personification and the ways in which we anthropomorphize, you know,
Yeah.
non-physical things, non-tangible
Anything,
things, like
honestly.
concepts, the way that
Hmm.
we anthropomorphize corporations and governments and all these different things, and the power
Hmm.
that we endow them or the power that
Hmm.
we take away.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a strange, it's a strange implementation of the human imagination.
But it's an interesting
Much,
technology, right? So if you
yeah,
can
yeah, yeah.
imagine that courts can appoint spokespersons for a forest, for a sea, for a cove, for a river, or so on, how would that change the way we conceive of environmental litigation? How would that change
Hmm.
the way we think
Yeah.
about balancing of interests? Like taking the commons and say, rather than just making them into property, what if we give them a voice? Even if it's an imaginary one, so what? We've accepted much grander fictions like money,
Hmm.
or human
Time.
rights for
Right,
corporations.
or
So
time,
Yeah,
yeah.
right.
yeah,
So I don't know why that's any more implausible. But that's like one of those interesting speculative things that we can imagine as a transformation for the societies that we live in.
Yeah,
yeah.
well, I wanna build on that with the, the transformation of, not only, the inception of a technology, but how it grows and changes with our society. I wanna talk a little bit about today's, technology and the conversations around it, specifically, and I feel like we've kinda touched on this even in part 1 of our chat with you when we were talking about Frankenstein a little bit, where it's, there's fear and fear mongering about technology. And so, what are your kind of current feelings about the current technologies and how they're impacting things? And, how should authors be using storytelling to counteract or, kind of interact with that fear?
Yeah, I mean, relevant to all of us, I think one of the pieces of technology that has suddenly shot into prominence and become sort of the thing for everybody to think about right now is the notion of AI, right? I mean,
Yeah.
some people don't like the name even. They don't want to call it intelligence because it's not intelligence. I don't. I'm not dogmatic
Yeah, but
about
degrees of
anything.
intelligence is such a confusing thing to
I
get
know.
into
I'm
anyways.
not. I'm not
Yeah.
dogmatic about it. I'm just going to call it AI, and people will know what I'm talking about. But I do think that the way we think about AI is very interesting because not only are technologies themselves utterances that express values, but even the way we talk about technology also obviously expresses our values, right? So I would say that I find something very interesting about the way we talk about AI right now is there's a huge bifurcation of opinion that seems very inconsistent. On the one hand, many authors and artists are upping arms and we want to litigate, and we're terrified about the idea that we will be replaced by AI, which suggests that AI seems quite powerful and good, and good in the sense of competent in at doing some things that we would think of as creativity or whatever. But at the same time, we also say all the time that AI is terrible in the sense that the products of AI are bad. That is, it can't even reproduce fingers properly. The stories it tells are garbage, so cliched, so devoid of feeling and soul. So,
As
which
if
is
there
it?
aren't cliches and tropes in
Okay,
human written fiction.
sure, point taken. But which is it? I mean, if
Yeah.
AI really is that bad, why are we scared? And if we are scared, do we really think AI is going to be that bad always? Or is there some way to reconcile these feelings? I mean, I feel like it's interesting that it reflects simultaneously contempt for AI, but also this terror of AI, which is not necessarily easily reconcilable for me. And I personally think that the Frankenstein's monster myth being so potent and so um, all encompassing, it's hard for us to think of even a different metaphor or a different mythological figure to talk about it. So what I've done, something that I'm incredibly interested in, is to think of a different mythological figure, a different symbol, a different way to contemplate AI. And so the symbol that I've settled on is the camera, which is why I'm so interested in the rise of camera as in the history of art. So, as I think I've mentioned in other contexts, um, there is actually a very interesting parallel to be drawn between the rise of the camera versus the rise of AI. When the camera was first invented, there was quite a bit of discourse about what exactly is this thing? What is this thing that we've invented? They called it painting by light, or sun writing, whatever. The idea was that somehow the processes of chemistry and physics, not human craft, led to the production of these images. So it's a mechanical process. And so there was a sense in which, even though artists were not threatened directly by in their livelihoods, in the sense that early photographs were terrible compared to portraits you could paint. They were black and white, and they required subjects to sit there for a long time and not move at all. And there was no attempt to elevate the subject, if you will. Like painters would elevate their subjects, but cameras don't lie, if you will. And so there was a lot of disdain for photographs. So, but at the same time, there was also a sense of threat, not in the sense that painters were going to lose their jobs, but in the sense of this is devaluing human craft. It took people years of practice to be able to reproduce the shape of something accurately using pencil and then paint. But a camera could do so trivially. The thing that we thought of as requiring human skill turned out to not require much human skill at all. And that was scary. So it's not the fact that art and artists were directly disvalued that was the problem. It was that the thing that they thought required human craft turned out not to be so. That was threatening. And I would argue that that's what ended up changing things. So if you follow the discourse of the camera throughout the 19th century and then into the 20th, it wasn't until photographers figure out how to turn the mechanical reproduction into something that was human craft based that elevated photography into an art form. So it took more than a century between the invention of photography and the first exhibition of photographs as fine art in Boston's Museum of Fine Art. And during that century, art photographers changed their approach. So if you go back to the first Supreme Court case that granted photographers copyright over their products, because before then, it was believed that photographs could not be copyrighted. I mean, how can you copyright a mechanical reproduction of nature? I mean, what does that mean? Well, the photographer who took a picture of Oscar Wilde said, look, I posed him a particular way. I selected what was to be in the photograph. I framed it in a certain way. I selected the shadows and the lights. I elevated my subject, right? All the things that painters were supposed to do, this photographer did. And the Supreme Court said, you're right. After all of that, we recognize that the camera is nothing more than a tool. You have been elevated. You as an artist are the author of the photograph because you did all this human craft to make it. That's the moment photography became a fine art, okay? And not only that, but the camera allowed artists to create cinema and TV, two of the most important forms of art that we have right now. They make more money than every other visual art combined. I mean, that's just, it's just the way it is. So the camera, which was at first seen as something that devalued human craft, ended up being a thing that promoted human craft. It invented entirely new realms of art, allowing human creativity to flourish and to express themselves in ways that could not be done before. Without the camera, without the physics and the chemistry of it, cinema would not be possible. We would never have broken the Aristotelian unities. I mean, cinema is the first dramatic art to just destroy the Aristotelian unities. And we've all somehow learned to interpret these stories with no trouble. I mean, that still blows my mind that in less than 100 years, essentially, this entire new language of telling stories using cinema that, jump cuts and cross cuts and fades and special effects.
The fact that Marvel has taught more people about the hero's journey than however many millions of stories across human history. Yeah.
Even novelists now write in a cinematic style. Like literally, even the way we tell stories is reshaped by cinema. It seems incredible. I don't even know how to think about it. So the point is, if you use the camera as the mythological symbol figure, then AI can be very hopeful. You don't have to fear AI. I have the feeling that right now, AI productions are not granted copyright because it's seen as merely a regurgitation of what humans have done. But at some point, would we not have figured out how to shape and author our own things using AI as a mere tool in the way that photographers eventually transcended mere reproduction and began to say, I am the author of this photograph? In what ways can those who use AI become the authors of the things that they're using AI to help generate? And also, even more interestingly, what are the ways in which we can now reimagine and reevaluate what is human craft? Visual artists learned that merely reproducing the form representationally was not sufficient to be art. There had to be something more. So visual arts moved in directions that are less representational. And when it comes to representational art, cameras became, the tools for new ways of storytelling. So it how will AI change the way we think about narrative art? What are the things that we now think of as requiring a lot of human craft, which now we think maybe don't? Maybe rhyming isn't such a big deal. Maybe good prosody isn't such an important skill. Maybe there are other ways that we can express our own human craft with when AI has taken over those functions. Maybe there are types of stories that we can tell that are not possible in the absence of AI, in the same way that there are kinds of stories that can be told with the camera that cannot be told without it. What are the other assumptions about narrative coherence that we can break once AI has become a tool for us to use? And I sort of think that this is much more promising and interesting and hopeful to me as a vision, because I'm very interested in thinking about how will AI, not being Frankenstein's monster, but being the camera, how will that change the way we think and practice art? Think about and practice art. That to me is far more interesting.
Yeah, because right now, like the conversations that I've been seeing or the conversations that I'm involved in, a lot of the perspectives that I've seen are either skeptical or negative. From the writing side, especially, we have things like training models, who like the training models are using published works as as basically like models for learning how to better process language and how to spit out prose that is replicable in terms of quality and whatnot. And then there are so many authors who, and I'm not blaming them. I don't
I
particularly
understand.
think that I would want my work to be included in a training model either. That's where the copyright issue comes into it.
Right.
Right.
And so I think like that complicates things. Then I've had conversations with artists who are vehemently opposed to the use of artificial intelligence in their artwork. Like I have like the Photoshop and Adobe suites where Adobe is incorporating a lot of AI tools into its different software. So it's like
Yep.
Photoshop has
Yeah, the
AI
auto
tools,
generate.
the auto generate tools, and all this
Yep.
different kind of stuff. That complicates matters. I have another friend who's an animator, and he actually came at it from an angle that I think is very in line with what you were talking about in terms of like he's looking at AI tools. There's one where there's you can basically give this AI program a still image, and what that program will do is it will take that still image and imagine what that body looks like from every angle,
Yes.
or what that image looks like from every angle, and it will animate it for
Yep.
you. And so it's like you could have art that you created originally, but augment it through this program in order to
Mhm.
animate it. And
Mhm.
so like from an animator's perspective, that's actually a really big time saving tool.
Absolutely.
Where for the
Absolutely.
animator,
Yeah.
where the animator's thinking at it is like, I can use this tool to A, save time, and B, create good quality animations that up my craft and allow me to explore avenues of creation that I never thought about before. And so
Absolutely.
it's like, on one hand, there are people who are just adamantly opposed to the use of AI. And there are a lot of people within the cover artist community, within the writing community, who are like, absolutely no AI kind of thing. But
Hmm.
then on the flip side, it's like I see my animator friend and people in different communities who are looking at it as like, how can I use this as a tool to better my craft? Not necessarily as a tool that will replace me,
Hmm.
but as something that will augment what I'm already capable of and help me
Yes.
achieve something greater.
That's such a great point you're making. I mean, this is why I think the camera angle is
It's
so
such a perfect analogy.
potent,
Yeah, I was
because
gonna say it's a really
yeah,
interesting metaphor. Yeah.
there are so many ways in which you set maps to that, right? Um, a lot of visual artists early on were very interested in photography, not because it somehow replaces them or whatever, but because they could use it to practice their art better. Two of the most common uses by early visual artists of photographs were: one, to make reproductions of their originals that they could then monetize and sell, and two, to use the camera as a way to produce studies from which they can then produce their final painting. So instead of producing sketches, they could use the camera to make these, what they would have to do in the past by sketching in advance of their painting the final scene. Like you were saying, artists today can use AI basically to do studies. There are, beyond the examples you give, you can easily imagine that a filmmaker can use AI to try out prototype, to use AI performances and so on to generate prototypes of scripts so they can see what a film could look like before committing to a particular vision. It will be amazing to be able to generate storyboards and prototype films quickly
Yeah.
like that, so you can
before
iterate.
before before the production studio says like how much money do we have to invest in a scene and then end up scrapping it after all the shooting has been done and all like the set
Right.
design and all that kind of stuff. It's like you
Right.
can kind of imagine that to give
Yep.
yourself some
So
forethought.
so if AI can be used to generate studies like that, then you can imagine, analogously, it would elevate the kind of art that artists can make. Similarly, there can be ways in which authorized reproductions or extensions of authors' works can be monetized. I can imagine, for example, an artist who would say, I have written a work. I can imagine a bunch of interesting potential expansions or um, customizations I could do with this work based on different readers. So I'm going to authorize AI to generate a bunch of things. So, for example, you can have a conversation with a minor character, um, generated by AI in accordance with the author's own particular guidelines for how the conversation would go. And then you could have a conversation with characters in books. I can imagine that being the sort of thing that authors would authorize and say, this can make me more money. This can extend my art in a way that allows more people to enjoy it, in the same way that visual artists sold prints of their works. Now, the objections to AI that we were talking about here are twofold, right? One is theft, right? Having your work being used into these training models without your permission, or having people generate works imitating your work and competing with you. Nobody wants that. That seems preposterously bad. So that's obviously a problem that we have to solve. The other problem is the whole devaluation of human craft, right? This is what we're talking about. The idea that because the AI can generate out and spit out uh, tropish stuff so easily, or generate graphic design logos so easily, does that devalue human craft? Is it possible that people would just not view what humans do as valuable anymore? That's a very interesting question, but I would say that based on the history of photography, it really will just force us to reinvent and rethink what is art, what are the things that we actually do that we value. Because, like I mentioned, even though visual artists were not largely impacted by photography, contrary to popular belief, engravers, a kind of artisanal art, they were impacted very, very severely by photography. Prior to photography, engravings and prints were the only ways to reproduce a piece of art for cheap copies for purchase. And engravers believed that they could reproduce a piece of art with soul, rather than the kind of mechanical reproduction that photography allowed. But the reality was, people were happy to buy photographs of works of art, and artists were happy to sell photographic reproductions. So engravers did lose out. That's just the way it is, and I'm not going to pretend that no one will be impacted by this. Some people will be impacted, but the question is, do we want to think about this as a net gain or a net loss? I think most of us would agree that the camera is a net gain ultimately for art by allowing the invention of entirely new mediums that could not have existed otherwise. I'm super curious, and I think it will take a long time for us to before we can figure this out. What are the new forms of art allowed by AI? I have no idea what they would be, because just like in early days of cinema, it's not possible to even see how ultimately you could get to um, the kind of you couldn't have imagined, for example, The Godfather, if all you could see of cinema was that scene of the train coming at the camera. That was not possible. In the same way that it's not possible for us to look at Midjourney and ChatGPT now and imagine what are the forms of art that AI would actually allow. We just can't
Yeah.
see it. We're gonna have to keep on experimenting and trying until we invent
Yeah.
it.
And it's
I
like
think
what
this
you were
has been the most
mentioning.
hopeful I've felt about
Yeah.
AI that I,
But it's like
this entire time.
it ties into what you were saying last episode, where it's like you're putting together a talk about human creativity and technology. And in this case, it's like what is coming to my mind is, after talking with my animator friend, after talking with different people in different fields, it's about the capabilities of the creator, the creativity of the creator with the tool in hand. So we are the creators of these tools, but the implications of that tool depends on our creativity and our imaginations to think about the ways in which it can be used, and obviously push aside and put a stop to things that are ultimately detrimental. Because it's like you brought up like hackers and this, and it's like I love the ways in which genres like cyberpunk have used hackers and more like disruptive members of society as the frame, as sort of like the frameworks through which we can view both the good and the bad about technology. And so it's like, even though there are often many bads about technologies, usually the people who are the most disruptive and the hackers and the people who are using those technologies in the ways that they weren't originally intended are the ones who then propose more interesting and more hopeful, ultimately, ironically, uses of those technologies and those
Absolutely.
tools.
Just like I said, the point of art is to misunderstand the artist. You could say that the point of technology is to use it in ways the inventors never intended. That is the whole
Exactly.
point.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
just to be even more hopeful about this, some people might say, okay, you have all this vision of AI as a tool. Okay, but what if AI does not remain a tool? What if AI actually becomes intelligent? What if it's becomes its own separate intelligence? And I say, even better. Even better. All right now, all we're talking about is AI imitating humans. But what if we could actually get to actual real intelligence, whatever that means, that is not merely a copy of humanity? That would be amazing. Now
You
we
know,
would actually have another consciousness with the universe to talk to engage with, to compare notes, to see if we
and you know what'd
understand them.
be the most amazing thing about that is to see what those artificial intelligent bees created in terms of their hive, what those artificial
Yes.
intelligent beavers
Yeah.
created in terms of their dams.
Oh my god, exactly. We humans have our intelligence, we evolved this entire technosphere. What would a separate intelligence do in terms of them growing their own technology? And oh, that's incredible. Like, I would totally read AI written novels in that case. Like, I would love to know what an aircraft carrier thinks about as it goes about its life. I would love to know how a satellite sees the universe. I mean, when that moment comes, I cannot wait to buy those novels. That will be incredible.
That that's why I love the works of Ian M. Banks, and especially his Culture series, is because it
Yeah.
imagines more esoteric applications of POV and sort of experience into the minds of artificial intelligences, into the minds of like legitimately like ship minds and things like that. And so I think
Yep.
that's why science fiction and fantasy, tech fi, fuck sci-fi. That's why tech fi and fantasy and all these different genres are so good, is that we can they're so good at allowing us to explore different points of view and different perspectives and empathize with those different perspectives. And so I think if we can fit technology into there and use it as a mechanism, because fiction in and of itself is a technology. It's like using technology to tell a story about technology that then influences the reality of our interaction with technology. So
100%.
So meta.
Yeah. And
so
so
fucking
cool.
meta,
Yeah.
MJ.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool.
Oh,
Well, this, I mean, honestly, this
yeah.
whole conversation has been fascinating and very cool.
Yeah.
But so, I mean, just to close us out, do you have any final pieces of advice, final nuggets for authors that
Yeah.
want to incorporate this kind of concept into their work?
Yeah, but my biggest piece of advice is don't think of technology as cold pieces of machinery that your characters interact with, or they have to use it in some way. I mean, that's the standard vision of what sci-fi or tech-fi is about, and it's couldn't be further from the truth. Technology is only interesting when it has meaning, when it is human. So think about, how does your technology, what story is it trying to tell, whose story is it trying to tell, right? If you're trying to write a story about, say, a new invention, some sort of machine that you think will be amazing, don't think of it as a machine. Think of it as the expression of the values and the stories of the inventor, the hacker, the salesperson, the marketing executive, the rebel, the skeptic, the critic. All of them are trying to express their values and telling their stories in the way, through the ways in which they interact with that piece of technology. Like, if you're talking about the internet, describing the internet is not interesting, but telling us about how the Kim Kardashian single-handedly invented one of the most popular uses for the internet, selfies. Now that's interesting. What are the values being expressed by a society that loves selfies? Freaking amazing. Anyway, that's yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's like Robert Oppenheimer and the creation of the nuclear bomb. It's like,
Yeah.
on one hand, you have so many different people with so many different perspectives on what this thing can do, you know? And from Oppenheimer's perspective, it's like he quotes the Bhagavad Gita and he's like, now I'm become death, the destroyer of worlds. And on the other hand, there are so many different applications of nuclear fission that we can use, and it's not just a weapon of war. And this is something that I love about your series, Ken, which I mentioned in the last episode, is the ways in which technology is used on so many different levels for both good and bad, and also mundane ways.
Yeah.
Like
technology,
selfies.
like selfies. It is interspersed throughout our lives, throughout our societies, and it is up to us to decide how we want to interact with it and how we want to create in ways that are more optimistic and hopeful. So
yeah.
Thank you, buddy. I really appreciate
Thank you. That was awesome.
Doing this masterclass with us and kicking off the year with us. It's 2024. Not right now when we're recording, but when these episodes go live. Speaking of fucking time and all that craziness. Yeah. All right, well, that's it for this mini masterclass and our two-parter with Ken Liu. Thank you so much for decoding this complex topic with us. It meant a lot to hang out with you and to talk about something so fascinating.
This was really fun.
Yeah,
thank you. So
Thank
Ken,
you.
where can folks find you online?
You can see me, probably the best place is my website, which is kenliu.name. And you can also sign up for my newsletter there. You can get to there from a link on my website or go to it directly, which is kenliu.substack.com.
Awesome. And you can also follow SFF Addicts on Instagram, Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, all that at sffaddictspod. You can follow me at Adrian M. Gibson. MJ, what about you?
Yeah, you can find me across all the major socials at MJ Kuhn Books, all one word, or check out my website, newsletter, all that good stuff at just mjkuhn.com.
Free newsletter, paid books.
Exactly.
Promote that shit. And go support Ken. Go pick up The Grace of Kings. Go pick up the Menagerie, The Hidden Girl, and Other Stories. Fantastic work. Thank you all for listening. Now, keep reading, keep imagining, and we'll see you next time on SFF Addicts.